He leaned across the center console of his leased Porsche, his eyes narrowing as he looked at my modest navy dress. Try not to embarrass me tonight. Naomi, these people are way above your level. I did not say a word. I simply stepped out of the car and walked in beside him. But when the billionaire host rushed over, bypassed my brother entirely, shook my hand, and announced that the entire board had been waiting to meet me, my brother went pale so fast it was genuinely satisfying. My name is Naomi, 33 years old, and for my entire life, my family treated me like a failure simply because I refused to play by their toxic rules. We were pulling up to a massive iron gate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The estate beyond the gates belonged to Harrison Caldwell, a venture capitalist who held the keys to my brother Preston and his failing tech startup. Preston gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was 36 years old, but still acted like an entitled teenager who expected the world to hand him a gold medal just for showing up. He had demanded I come tonight, not as a guest, but as his unpaid assistant. My only job was to carry his heavy presentation materials, fetch him drinks, and fade into the background while he tried to secure $50 million in funding. As the valet approached our car, my phone buzzed in my lap. It was our family group chat. I glanced down at the screen. My sister Clara had just sent a message. Please tell me you made Naomi buy a decent outfit. Preston, we do not want Mr. Caldwell thinking our family brings the hired help to a formal dinner. Immediately, her husband, DeAndre, chimed in. DeAndre was a corporate chief financial officer who loved throwing around buzzwords to make himself sound important. He replied to Clara. Just make sure she stays away from the VIP tables. We do not need her lack of financial literacy ruining Preston in his pitch. Remind her which fork to use for the salad. Bro. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. A cold, familiar numbness washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a sharp sense of clarity. For years, this was how they spoke to me. I remembered being 18 years old, forced to wear a stained hand-me-down dress while I served appetizers at Preston and his college graduation party. My parents had told me to stay in the kitchen so I would not ruin the aesthetic of their perfect family photos. They constantly diminished my worth because I chose to build my own path instead of feeding into their narcissistic delusions. Preston snatched the keys back from the valet and tossed them to the attendant with an arrogant flick of his wrist. He turned to me, smoothing the lapels of his velvet tuxedo jacket. Did you see the group chat? He asked, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Clara and DeAndre have a point. Just stand near the coat check until I need my slides. Do not speak to the investors. You do not understand how high-stakes corporate finance works. And I cannot risk you saying something stupid. I looked at my brother, taking in his sweaty brow and the desperate, frantic energy vibrating beneath his expensive cologne. He was drowning in debt, projecting an image of massive wealth while his company burned to the ground. He thought he was walking into this mansion to secure a lifeline. He had absolutely no idea that he was walking straight into a trap. Resting heavily on my lap was a thick black leather portfolio. Preston thought it contained his pitch deck and his fabricated financial projections. He was wrong. Inside that portfolio was a 400-page forensic audit. It was stamped with the red seals of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. What my toxic family did not know was that I was not a failed college dropout working a dead-end job. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Intel, one of the most ruthless and respected corporate due diligence firms in the United States. Harrison Caldwell had personally hired my firm to investigate Preston and his startup before committing a single dollar of investment. I had spent the last 3 months tearing apart my brother and his fraudulent empire piece by piece. I adjusted the heavy portfolio, running my fingers over the smooth leather. The weight of it felt like justice. Every fake user account, every hidden offshore shell company, Every forged signature my brother had used to secure predatory loans was documented right here in my hands. DeAndre thought I lacked financial literacy. Clara thought I was the hired help. Preston thought I was just a prop to carry his bags. I took a deep breath of the crisp evening air as we walked up the sweeping marble steps of the estate. The massive mahogany doors loomed ahead of us. I did not feel anxious. I did not feel sad. I felt entirely at peace. For decades. I had allowed them to dictate my worth. I had swallowed their insults, endured their exclusion, and watched them build their glossy, perfect lives on a foundation of lies and exploitation. Tonight, that foundation was going to crumble, and I was going to be the one holding the sledgehammer. This was the moment of absolute reckoning. The air crackled with a quiet intensity, promising a storm they could never have prepared for. If you have ever had to sit in silence while your toxic family treated you like the punchline to their joke, hit like and subscribe because the ultimate punchline was waiting for them inside that mansion. And they were about to learn exactly what happens when you underestimate the person you have been stepping on your entire life. We stepped out of the luxury vehicle, and the sheer magnitude of the Greenwich estate immediately overwhelmed the senses. Tall, imposing marble columns framed a grand entryway that radiated old money and uncompromising power. This was not the superficial, heavily leveraged lifestyle my brother desperately attempted to project to his social circle. This was institutional wealth, the kind of quiet financial dominance that dictated market trends and quietly controlled industries. Preston adjusted the lapels of his rented velvet tuxedo jacket. His chest puffed out with completely unearned arrogance. He was 36 years old, but still operated with reckless entitlement. He truly believed he was the most important person walking up those wide, sweeping stone steps. Tonight, a sharply dressed valet approached us quickly, maintaining perfect professional posture as he reached out for our belongings. Preston unbuttoned his coat and shoved it into the waiting hands of the valet without a single glance. He treated the estate staff exactly the way he had treated me my entire life. Like invisible machinery, he turned toward me, his expression twisting into a familiar, condescending sneer that I knew all too well. He reached out and aggressively grabbed my elbow, digging fingers deep. He tightened his grip on my arm to establish physical dominance. Listen to me very carefully. He hissed his breath, smelling sharply of the expensive mints he chewed compulsively. I see the catering staff waiting area right over there through that side corridor near the kitchen entrance. You are going to take my portfolio, march over to that folding chair, and sit there in absolute silence. Do not look at anyone, and do not try to network with people who are vastly superior to you. If any of the investors happen to ask who you are, just tell them nothing. Just say you are my temporary assistant. He demanded ruthlessly. I looked down at his hand, gripping my arm, refusing to flinch or show any sign of intimidation. I am perfectly fine standing right here. Preston, I replied softly, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. Preston's face flushed a deep, angry red as he opened his mouth to deliver another string of vicious insults. He was likely preparing to threaten me with public humiliation, just like our mother always did during family gatherings. But before he could utter a single syllable, the massive custom-built mahogany doors fully opened. The heavy doors swung completely open, revealing the sophisticated hum of elite corporate networking and clinking crystal that spilled out into the cool, crisp evening air. Stepping out from the warm golden glow of the grand foyer was the billionaire host himself, Harrison Caldwell. Harrison was a man who commanded absolute respect without ever needing to raise his voice or demand attention. At 50 years old, he possessed the rugged, intimidating charisma of a man who routinely dismantled corporations before breakfast. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit without a tie, exuding a natural authority that made Preston shrink back. Preston instantly transformed the angry bully vanishing and being replaced by a desperate, sycophantic salesman eager to please. He squared his shoulders, plastered on a blindingly fake smile, and practically lunged forward to greet the billionaire. Mr. Caldwell Preston announced loudly, thrusting his right hand out with aggressive, overly eager enthusiasm toward the host. Preston Hayes, Chief Executive Officer of NextGen Solutions, and it is an absolute honor to be welcomed here today. I have been looking forward to demonstrating exactly how our platform will completely disrupt the tech landscape this year. Preston stood there vibrating with desperate anticipation tonight. He was ready to charm the billionaire with the ridiculous financial buzzwords DeAndre had fed him earlier this morning. Harrison Caldwell did not slow his stride, nor did he offer even a polite nod to my desperate brother. He completely ignored Preston's outstretched hand, walking straight past him as if my brother were simply an architectural flaw on the porch. Preston froze instantly, his hand still suspended awkwardly in midair while his arrogant smile cracked around the edges. Harrison stopped directly in front of me, his stern, intimidating face immediately softening into an expression of profound, genuine, immense respect. He extended both of his hands, grasping my right hand with a genuine warmth that completely paralyzed my brother. Naomi Harrison said, his deep, resonant voice carrying clearly across the stone portico and echoing into the quiet night. Finally, after all these months of remote correspondence, we have all been waiting anxiously to meet you in person. I offered him a confident, professional smile, standing tall and matching the energy of the wealthiest men in America. It is a pleasure to finally be here, Harrison, and I must say your estate is absolutely breathtaking tonight. Harrison laughed warmly aloud indeed. It was a booming, authentic sound that contrasted sharply with the fake, sterile networking chuckles happening inside the mansion. Forget the house, Naomi, because the entire board is inside, and they are absolutely buzzing after reading your summary. Your firm does spectacular work, and the precision of your analytics is completely unmatched in the industry right now. I nodded gracefully, letting the validation wash over me while keeping my posture immaculate and my expression fiercely composed. Aegis Intel prides itself on providing absolute clarity. Harrison and I brought the finalized forensic documents with me today. Harrison glanced downward very quickly. He looked at the heavy black leather portfolio in my hands, his eyes gleaming with sharp strategic anticipation. Excellent. Let my personal security team place that safely in my private study until the formal presentations begin shortly. Before I could hand it over the head valet, the same man Preston had treated horribly rushed forward eagerly. He gave me a deferential bow, holding out his arms. "Allow me to take your coat." "Mom," the valet offered, treating me with the absolute reverence of royalty. Preston's jaw dropped instantly as he stood completely frozen in sheer, absolute, devastating, silent, profound disbelief. Harrison Caldwell offered me one final approving nod before turning his attention toward another arriving black luxury vehicle. He smoothly excused himself to greet an incoming senator, leaving me standing under the grand portico. The head valet had already disappeared inside with my coat and my securely locked portfolio, leaving Preston and me completely alone near the towering entrance. The cold night air suddenly felt thick with an explosive, dangerous energy. For a few seconds, Preston just stood there staring at the spot where the billionaire had been standing. His mind was visibly malfunctioning as it tried to process a reality that completely shattered his fragile, narcissistic worldview. He had spent months telling his investors and our family that he was the golden child of the tech industry. Now, the very man holding the purse strings had treated him like an absolute nobody. Then the shock fractured into pure, unadulterated rage. Preston lunged forward. He did not care that we were standing outside a billionaire estate. He did not care about the lingering security guards stationed near the perimeter. His hand shot out and clamped down hard on my upper arm. His grip was bruising and desperate, driven by a sudden, blinding panic. He yanked me roughly backward, pulling me away from the grand entrance and forcing me into the heavy shadows behind a massive marble pillar. The sudden, violent movement forced me to stumble slightly in my heels. but I quickly regained my footing. I slammed my back against the cold stone of the pillar, refusing to show even a flicker of fear. Preston slammed his hand against the marble right next to my head, boxing me into the shadows. His face was inches from mine, his features contorted into an ugly mask of panic and venom. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his rented tuxedo. "What the hell was that?" He hissed, his voice a frantic, venomous whisper. "How do you know Harrison Caldwell? Why is he treating a pathetic little dropout like you with any level of respect? Answer me right now. Naomi, tell me exactly what kind of sick game you are playing behind my back. You were supposed to just stand there and hold my bags." I simply stared at him. I did not flinch. I did not cower. I looked at the sweat forming on his forehead and the absolute terror swimming in his eyes. He was a man watching his carefully constructed house of cards catch fire, and he was desperately trying to find someone else to blame for the smoke. When I refused to answer immediately, his panic mutated into a vile, sickening attack. He resorted to the only weapon he had ever known how to use against me: pure psychological manipulation. He needed to drag me down to his level to make sense of his own profound insecurity. "Oh, I get it now," Preston sneered, his lips curling into a disgusted, malicious smile. "You are sleeping with him. That is it. Is it not my perfect little failure of a sister could not make it in the real corporate world? So she decided to open her legs to a billionaire. You found out I was pitching tonight, and you decided to use your body to sabotage my company. You are disgusting. Naomi, you are absolutely pathetic. You could not earn a legitimate seat at the table, so you found a wealthy man to grant you charity access. You think you are so smart, but you are just cheap. His accusations were vile, but they lacked any real power over me. Years ago, words like these would have broken me. I would have cried. I would have defended myself frantically, trying to prove my worth to a brother who only wanted to see me destroyed. I would have begged him to believe my innocence and pleaded for his basic respect. But tonight, his words were just empty noise. They were the frantic, desperate flailings of a cornered animal. Realizing the trap was already sprung, he leaned in closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, attempting to assert the dominance he had wielded over me since childhood. "I am going to tell Mom and Dad exactly what you are doing." Preston threatened, his voice dripping with malice. "I am going to walk right into that ballroom and tell them that their daughter is operating as a high-class escort. I am going to tell Diane and Richard that you are trading sexual favors for networking opportunities. They will be so disgusted with you. Naomi, they will finally see you for the trash you really are. They will never speak to you again, and neither will I. You are going to be completely cut off from this family forever. You will have absolutely nothing and nobody." He thought the threat of losing our toxic parents would terrify me. He thought the idea of being alienated from our deeply dysfunctional family would bring me to my knees. He expected me to break down crying right there in the shadows. He wanted me to beg for his silence and apologize for stepping out of my assigned role as the family scapegoat. He needed me to be weak so he could feel strong again. I did not cry. I did not panic. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over my entire body. I looked at my brother, and I did not see a powerful corporate founder. I saw a terrified little boy wearing a suit he could not afford, pitching a company that did not actually exist. The sheer pathetic nature of his threats only solidified my absolute resolve to execute my professional duty. The night. I slowly raised my left hand. I placed my fingers directly over his bruising grip on my right arm. With a smooth, deliberate, and unyielding application of force, I pried his fingers off my skin. I pushed his hand away with absolute finality. Preston stumbled back a half step, completely caught off guard by my physical resistance. I stood up straight, pulling my shoulders back and stepping out of the shadows. I took a moment to adjust my dress. I reached down and methodically straightened my cuff, moving with the slow, deliberate precision of a woman who was entirely in control of her environment. I brushed a non-existent piece of lint from my sleeve, letting the silence stretch between us. I looked Preston directly in the eyes, stripping away every ounce of familial obligation I had ever felt toward him. My gaze was lethal and completely devoid of empathy. "You are pathetic, Preston," I said softly, my voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. "You have spent your entire life tearing me down because you are fundamentally terrified of your own mediocrity. You think your lies and your manipulation can save you tonight. But you have absolutely no idea what is waiting for you inside that room." Preston opened his mouth to shout another insult, but the words died in his throat. The sheer intensity of my composure silenced him. He looked at me as if he was seeing a complete stranger. "Go inside, Preston," I commanded my tone, leaving no room for argument or debate. "Your little stage play tonight needs a VIP audience, and you would not want to keep your investors waiting." I turned my back on his stunned silence and pushed through the heavy mahogany doors. The transition from the crisp evening air into the grand ballroom was like stepping into another dimension entirely. The space was a masterpiece of Gilded Age architecture, modernized for the apex of American wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung suspended from a soaring, vated ceiling, casting a brilliant golden light over a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, murmuring hum of high-stakes networking. Waiters in immaculate white coats circulated with silver trays of champagne, moving silently among the crowd of venture capitalists, tech mogul, and hedge fund managers. This was the ultimate inner circle of Greenwich elite. Everyone in this room possessed the kind of financial leverage that could bankrupt a small country before lunchtime. I stood near the entryway, taking a steady breath and allowing my eyes to scan the vast room. I was looking for the seating chart when a harsh, sudden burst of overly loud laughter pierced the refined atmosphere. My gaze snapped toward the source of the disruption near a towering champagne fountain. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Standing there completely oblivious to the irritated glances of the billionaires surrounding them was my entire toxic family. My mother, Diane, was wearing a sequined gown that looked desperately out of place. Beside her stood my father, Richard, attempting to look wealthy while holding his posture with a rigid, uncomfortable stiffness. My younger sister, Clara, clung to the arm of her husband, DeAndre. DeAndre stood tall and arrogant, adjusting his expensive watch and looking around the room as if he were already evaluating which assets he was going to buy. They were practically vibrating with unearned pride. The realization hit me immediately. Preston had not just lied about his user acquisition numbers. He had actively used his fraudulent founder status to manipulate the guest list and sneak our entire family into this exclusive gala. He needed his personal audience. He wanted our parents to witness what he believed would be his ultimate coronation as a tech billionaire. They had no business being here. Their presence was a chaotic disruption in a room defined by quiet power. But Preston needed his enablers. He needed the people who had sacrificed my future to fund his elaborate lies to stand in the front row and applaud his fake triumph. As I watched them, Clara pointed a manicured finger in my direction. She whispered something to Diane. My mother head snapped toward the entrance, her eyes locked onto mine, and I watched the fake pleasant smile instantly vanish from her face. It was replaced by a furious, twisting scowl of absolute disgust. Diane slammed her champagne flute onto a passing waiter tray with such aggressive force that the crystal nearly shattered. She did not casually walk toward me. She marched across the ballroom floor with the singular, focused rage of a woman whose carefully curated aesthetic had just been deeply offended. She moved with a terrifying entitlement, pushing past two prominent investors without offering a single word of apology. I held my ground. I did not shrink back or drop my gaze as she closed the distance between us. Diane stopped exactly 1 inch away from my face, violently invading my personal space to establish physical dominance. What in the world do you think you are doing? Naomi, she hissed, her voice a harsh, frantic whisper designed to avoid echoing across the marble floors. Why are you walking through the main guest entrance? I specifically told Preston to make sure you use the service doors by the kitchen. You are completely embarrassing us. I looked at her highlighted hair and her furious, narrowed eyes. The sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering. She was a guest who had sneaked into a billionaire estate on false pretenses. Yet she believed she had the authority to dictate which doors I was allowed to use. You are supposed to be helping Preston carry his materials. Diane continued aggressively, jabbing her finger toward my chest. You are not a guest tonight. Naomi, you are just a prop. Do you have any idea how much damage your presence is doing to this family image right now? Look around you. Naomi, my mother demanded, gesturing wildly toward the sea of venture capitalists and executives. These are the Greenwich elite. These people hold the keys to your brother future. Preston is about to secure $50 million tonight. He is going to elevate our entire bloodline into the upper echelon of American society. And here you are, strutting through the front doors in that cheap, basic dress, trying to draw attention to yourself as usual. You are completely tarnishing our image in front of the most important people in the country. If anyone asks who you are, you keep your mouth shut. Do not you dare tell these billionaires that you are related to us. Do not ruin your brother Big Night with your pathetic failure of a life. The venom in her words was meant to paralyze me. She expected me to lower my head, apologize profusely, and scurry away to hide. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of my assigned role as the worthless disappointment. Instead, I remained entirely motionless. I did not break eye contact. I looked at the woman who had spent 33 years systematically destroying my self-worth to elevate a son who was currently committing federal wire fraud. I let the terrible silence stretch between us, allowing her aggressive energy to crash against my absolute composure. I tightened my firm grip on the heavy leather portfolio containing the forensic audit that was about to obliterate her entire world. I did not need to raise my voice. The truth was securely locked in my hands. I simply smiled, a cold, terrifying smile, causing Diane to take a sudden step backward. Before my mother could recover from the sudden shift in my demeanor, a new shadow fell over us. DeAndre and my sister Clara had noticed the standoff and strolled over to join the interrogation. DeAndre was wearing a custom-tailored designer suit that screamed of new money and poor judgment. He moved with the exaggerated swagger of a man desperately trying to convince a room full of actual billionaires that he belonged among them. As the chief financial officer of Preston and his fake tech startup DeAndre walked around with an inflated sense of superiority, convinced that his title granted him immunity from the rules of basic human decency. Clara clung tightly to his arm, wearing a diamond necklace that I knew for a fact was purchased using funds siphoned directly from early-stage investors. They approached me with matching expressions of profound condescension, looking me up and down as if I were a piece of trash that had somehow blown through the front doors of the estate. DeAndre stopped right next to my mother, holding an empty crystal champagne flute in his right hand. He did not bother offering a greeting. He simply extended his arm and shoved the empty glass directly toward my chest, expecting me to automatically take it. "Go make yourself useful, Naomi," he ordered, his voice dripping with absolute arrogance. "Why do not you optimize your deliverables tonight and fetch me a fresh glass of the reserve vintage? Try to maximize the return on investment of your presence here, since bringing you was clearly a massive liability, and do it quickly. I have to mingle with the venture capitalists, and I cannot be seen standing here holding my own empty glass like some entry-level intern." He used corporate jargon like a weapon, wielding ridiculous phrases to mask the fact that he was actively committing securities fraud. He wanted to make me feel small, to remind me that in his eyes, I was nothing more than an uneducated assistant, lucky to be breathing the same air as him. I looked down at the empty flute hovering inches from my dress, but I did not lift a finger to take it. The silence stretched heavy and uncomfortable. Clara rolled her eyes, stepping forward to reinforce her husband in his demands. Honestly, Naomi Clara chimed in, her tone sharp and patronizing. Do what DeAndre says and then go find a quiet corner to hide in. Do not speak to anyone tonight. Do not try to network, and absolutely do not try to join any conversations. You lack the basic financial literacy required to understand anything these people are talking about. If a board member asks you a question, you will just end up humiliating yourself and ruining the valuation of my husband and his company. These investors are looking for sophisticated financial models, not the naive ramblings of a girl who could not even finish her degree. Just stand by the coat check where you belong and stay out of our way. My sister stood there dripping in stolen wealth, lecturing me about financial literacy. The irony was so rich it was practically intoxicating. She had absolutely no idea that the sophisticated financial models she was bragging about had already been flagged by federal authorities. She did not know that the diamond necklace resting on her collarbone was going to be seized as evidence of wire fraud by tomorrow morning. They looked at me with such absolute certainty, fully convinced of their own untouchable superiority. I slowly shifted my gaze from Clara back to DeAndre, staring directly into his arrogant eyes. I still did not take the glass from his hand. Instead, I waited exactly 3 seconds. The psychological weight of my refusal began to register on his face. His confident smirk faltered slightly as his arm remained extended in the air, holding the empty crystal flute like a fool. At that exact moment, a waiter in a pristine white uniform walked past us carrying a silver tray. Without breaking eye contact with DeAndre, I smoothly reached out, took the empty glass from his hand, using only 2 fingers, and gracefully set it down onto the passing waiter and his tray. The clink of the crystal against the silver rang out clearly over the low hum of the ballroom. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or hurt. I maintained perfect, terrifying composure. I smoothed the front of my dress, adjusted the heavy black leather portfolio under my arm, and offered DeAndre a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. I highly recommend you go get your own drink. DeAndre, I said, my voice quiet, precise, and lethal. In fact, you should drink as much of that reserve vintage champagne as you possibly can tonight. Enjoy every single drop of it while you can still afford it. DeAndre stiffened his eyes, narrowing as he tried to process the hidden threat in my words. He opened his mouth to fire back another corporate insult, but the absolute chilling confidence in my posture silenced him. Clara scoffed completely, misinterpreting my warning as petty jealousy. She grabbed her husband by the arm and pulled him away, muttering loud enough for me to hear that I was just a bitter, broke failure who could not handle their immense success. My mother shot me one final look of pure disgust before rushing after them to secure her place near the center of the room. I stood alone near the entrance, watching them march proudly toward their own destruction. The psychological tension thickened the air, heavy with the impending reality that they were entirely blind to. They thought they owned the world tonight. They had no idea that I already held the deed to their absolute ruin. The grand dinner chimes finally began to ring throughout the vast estate, echoing beautifully across the opulent ballroom to signal that the main corporate event was officially starting now. As the melodic ringing of the dinner chimes faded into the high vaulted ceilings of the ballroom, a subtle shift in the crowd began. The sea of venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and tech executives slowly transitioned from the cocktail area toward the grand dining hall. The space was breathtaking. Massive crystal chandeliers hung suspended above 3 incredibly long banquet tables draped in heavy white silk. Towering centerpieces of white orchids and silver candelabras lined the center of each table, reflecting the warm ambient light. At the very front of the room, positioned perfectly to command the attention of every single guest, sat the primary VIP table. This was where the elite of the elite were designated to sit, including Harrison Caldwell himself. I moved with the flow of the wealthy crowd, maintaining my steady and measured pace. I carried the heavy black leather portfolio under my left arm, feeling the satisfying weight of the forensic audit pressing against my side. Ahead of me, I spotted my family, my mother, Diane, and my father, Richard, were eagerly searching the silver-plated name cards at the secondary tables, desperate to find their assigned spots. Clara and DeAndre were walking just a few paces ahead of me. DeAndre was busy adjusting his designer tie, actively scanning the room to see which billionaires he could corner during the meal. Clara marched forward with absolute entitlement, heading straight toward the front of the dining hall. She clearly assumed that because Preston was pitching tonight, she and her husband belonged at the head table. I watched closely as she reached the VIP section. Her eyes darted across the elegant calligraphy on the heavy card's stockic nameplates. She found Harrison Caldwell and his card positioned perfectly at the center. Then she looked at the seat directly to his right. I saw her entire body freeze. Her perfectly manicured hand paused in midair. The heavy cardstock placed at the right hand of the billionaire host clearly and unmistakably read Naomi. Clara stared at my name as if the elegant black ink were a personal insult directed entirely at her. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. She immediately looked around, scanning the room until her furious gaze locked onto me, walking calmly down the aisle. She did not hesitate for a single second, driven by pure narcissistic rage and the absolute certainty that she was superior to me in every conceivable way. Clara reached out and snatched my name card right off the VIP table. She gripped the card so tightly her knuckles turned white. She then reached into her designer clutch, pulled out her own assigned seating card, which she had undoubtedly snatched from a lesser table, and slammed it down onto the empty space next to Harrison Caldwell. She marched directly toward me, completely disregarding the high-profile executives finding their seats all around us. DeAndre followed closely behind her, his chest puffed out, ready to reinforce whatever humiliating command his wife was about to deliver. Clara stopped directly in my path, physically blocking me from walking any closer to the front of the room. She shoved my name card directly into my chest, forcing me to catch it before it fell to the marble floor. "What is wrong with you, Naomi?" Clara hissed loudly. Her voice was sharp and frantic, echoing slightly over the low hum of the gathering guests. "Did you seriously think you could just sneak up to the VIP table and switch the name cards when nobody was looking? You are completely delusional." I looked down at the crumpled card in my hand, then back up at my sister. I did not move the name card. "Clara," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any defensive panic. "That is exactly where the event organizers placed it." "Do not lie to me," Clara snapped, stepping even closer. The sheer entitlement radiating off her was almost suffocating. "You are just a bitter, jealous failure trying to steal the spotlight on Preston and his big night. Mr. Caldwell does not even know who you are. The catering staff obviously made a massive administrative error, or you bribed a waiter to put your name up there. Either way, it ends right now." DeAndre crossed his arms over his expensive suit, looking down at me with profound disgust. "You really have zero situational awareness," Naomi DeAndre added, shaking his head. "You do not belong at that table. You do not have the portfolio, the capital, or the basic financial literacy to sit next to a man who controls a $50 billion venture fund. Stop trying to force your way into spaces where you are clearly unwanted. It is pathetic." Clara pointed her finger sharply toward the very back of the massive dining hall, directing my attention toward a small, dimly lit overflow table positioned directly next to the swinging kitchen doors. "That is where you belong," she commanded loudly. "Go sit at the overflow table with the event staff and the audio technicians. Stay out of sight. Keep your mouth shut. And do not you dare try to approach the front of this room again tonight. I have already fixed the seating arrangement. DeAndre and I will be sitting with Mr. Caldwell representing this family the right way." I looked at her pointing finger, then at the distant table near the kitchen. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to defend my rightful place. I simply nodded, maintaining my absolute terrifying composure. If you truly believe that is where I belong, Clara, then I will gladly stand aside and let you claim that VIP seat. I smoothed the front of my dress, holding my portfolio tightly. Please, DeAndre, lead the way. Show these billionaires exactly who you are. I turned and began walking slowly toward the swinging kitchen doors, leaving them standing completely unaware of the devastating and highly public execution that was about to unfold. I walked away from the center of the grand dining hall with deliberate, slow steps. The polished marble floor clicked softly beneath my heels as I approached the swinging kitchen doors. I found the small overflow table pushed against a dark wood-paneled wall. It was surrounded by bustling waiters carrying silver trays and audio technicians adjusting sound equipment. I stood quietly in the shadows and turned to look back toward the front of the room. Clara and DeAndre were already taking their stolen places at the main table. Clara smoothed her designer dress with a deeply satisfied smirk. She leaned close to Harrison Caldwell's empty chair, posing perfectly as if she had been born to sit among billionaires. DeAndre buttoned his suit jacket and proudly surveyed the room. They looked like two vultures who had successfully hijacked a throne. Suddenly, the sharp, clear sound of a spoon tapping against crystal rang out across the cavernous ballroom. The ambient chatter of 100 wealthy investors died down instantly. Harrison Caldwell stepped up to the polished glass podium located just inches away from where my sister was sitting. He adjusted the microphone and smiled warmly at the attentive audience. Welcome, everyone, to this momentous evening. Harrison began, his deep voice echoing flawlessly through the state-of-the-art sound system. We are gathered here tonight to discuss the future of technology and to allocate capital to the brightest minds in the industry. But before we begin the formal pitches and before we enjoy this magnificent dinner, I need to address a matter of vital importance. The room fell into absolute pin-drop silence. Every venture capitalist and hedge fund manager leaned forward in their velvet chairs. I watched my brother Preston standing near the front looking incredibly eager. Preston actually puffed out his chest, clearly believing that Harrison was about to praise his startup. Instead, Harrison gripped the edges of the podium, and his expression turned incredibly serious. In the world of high-stakes venture capital, we are often blinded by flashy presentations and aggressive financial projections. Harrison continued, We are taught to chase unicorns, but sometimes a unicorn is just a donkey wearing a taped-on horn. A ripple of polite corporate laughter moved through the crowd. DeAndre chuckled loudly, trying to demonstrate his insider status. Harrison did not laugh. His gaze hardened into pure steel. Recently, my firm was mere days away from committing $50 million to what we believed was a revolutionary tech platform. Harrison revealed, We thought we had conducted proper due diligence. We were completely wrong. We were walking blindly into a catastrophic financial disaster that would have severely damaged our investors and our reputation. Preston's eager smile completely vanished from his sweating face. The color rapidly drained from his cheeks. Harrison swept his hand out toward the audience. We were saved from this monumental mistake by one person, a brilliant mind who refused to accept superficial data at face value. We hired an independent auditing firm to look under the hood. Harrison explained, his voice ringing with profound respect. And the chief executive officer of that firm personally spearheaded the investigation. She uncovered a web of fabricated user metrics, hidden offshore accounts, and severe structural fraud that our own internal teams completely missed. Because of her relentless dedication to the truth, Caldwell Ventures avoided a massive catastrophe. Tonight, we are not just investing money, we are honoring absolute integrity. I want to publicly recognize the incredible Chief Executive Officer of Egypt Intel. Please join me at the head. Naomi Harrison extended his hand and pointed directly past the glittering chandeliers, past the wealthy elite, and straight toward the dark shadows by the kitchen doors. A brilliant white spotlight instantly snapped on, slicing through the dimness and landing directly on me. I stood perfectly still, holding my black leather portfolio. The entire room turned around to look at the woman standing by the service entrance. The collective gasp that erupted from my family was audible, even from across the massive ballroom. My mother, Diane, clamped her hands over her open mouth. My father, Richard, physically stumbled backward in absolute shock. Preston looked as if he had just been struck by lightning. His mouth hung open, forming a silent scream of absolute terror. He stared at me, standing in the spotlight, realizing that the sister he had designated as a prop was actually the corporate executioner holding his fate in her hands. But the most spectacular reaction belonged to Clara. She sat frozen in the seat directly next to the podium. She looked at Harrison, pointing at me, then looked down at the stolen name card sitting on the table. Her face turned an alarming shade of mottled, panic-stricken red. Harrison looked down at Clara, sitting in the seat he had specifically reserved for me. "Excuse me, young lady," Harrison said, his voice polite, but carrying a distinct edge of icy billionaire authority. "I believe you are sitting in the guest of honor chair." Clara swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly. She scrambled to her feet so quickly that her chair scraped harshly against the marble floor. DeAndre sat beside her, completely paralyzed. Clara grabbed her designer clutch and began an agonizingly slow, extremely public walk of shame away from the head table. Every single investor watched her humiliating retreat. I stepped out of the dark shadows and began my extremely long walk down the center aisle. I did not rush myself. I walked forward with the slow, measured cadence of a predator who had already won the hunt. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone floor. As I passed my parents, Diane reached out a trembling hand toward me, but I did not even spare her a glance. I kept my eyes locked fiercely on Clara as she awkwardly shuffled past me to find a seat in the back. I reached the podium and gracefully took my rightful place at the VIP table. Harrison Caldwell nodded to me with a warm smile before leaning back into his velvet chair. He raised his right hand and signaled the audiovisual team stationed at the very back of the massive ballroom. The glittering crystal chandeliers dimmed slightly, and a giant high-defin screen illuminated directly behind the glass podium. It boldly displayed the sleek modern logo of my brother and his technology company. It was finally time for the main event to begin. Harrison cleared his throat loudly and addressed the elite crowd of billionaires, venture capitalists, and hedge fund managers once more tonight. Right now. Now that we have officially recognized the brilliant minds protecting our institutional capital, it is time to closely examine the unique opportunities actively seeking it. Harrison announced smoothly. Our first presentation this evening comes from a founder aiming to completely disrupt the digital communications sector with a revolutionary platform. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the Chief Executive Officer of NextGen Solutions, Preston Hayes. Polite applause immediately rippled through the expansive dining hall. From my magnificent vantage point at the VIP table, I had a perfect unobstructed view of my brother as he began moving forward. Now Preston made his agonizingly slow walk toward the brightly lit stage. He was sweating profusely under the intense spotlight. A visible sheen of moisture heavily coated his pale forehead, and the rigid, tight line of his jaw betrayed the absolute terror vibrating beneath his rented tuxedo. He gripped a small remote clicker in his right hand so aggressively tightly that his knuckles were stark white. He was a deeply desperate man, willingly stepping onto a dangerous trapdoor. But he truly had no other choice except to bravely walk forward and pull the heavy lever entirely by himself today. Right now. Preston finally reached the glass podium and turned slowly to face the 100 powerful financial titans staring directly back at him. He deliberately and carefully avoided looking anywhere near my seat. His anxious eyes darted nervously around the opulent room before he forcefully plastered on that familiar, nauseatingly fake smile he had obsessively practiced in front of mirrors since our childhood. "Good evening, everyone," Preston began speaking, his voice shaking slightly before he forced it downward into an artificial register of booming, arrogant confidence. "I stand before you tonight not just as a dedicated technology founder today, but also as a man deeply grounded in traditional family values. Preston declared confidently, "Everything I have diligently built, and everything I am about to show you is firmly rooted in the unwavering support of the incredible people who shaped me." He aggressively clicked the small remote. The blank screen behind him instantly transitioned to a massive, glowing photograph of our toxic parents, Diane and Richard standing proudly beside him and Clara. I watched silently as Preston launched into a disgusting, fabricated emotional monologue about endless loyalty, profound sacrifice, and unbreakable family bonds specifically tailored to manipulate the incredibly wealthy, trusting investors today. "My wonderful mother and father taught me the true meaning of dedication," Preston loudly declared, placing his left hand theatrically over his beating heart. "They sacrificed absolutely everything they had to give me the strong foundation required to build this revolutionary digital platform. They believed in my grand vision so deeply that they willingly leveraged their entire life savings to provide my initial seed capital. They are my ultimate inspiration and my heroes." Diane beamed with absolute ridiculous pride, wiping a perfectly manufactured fake tear from her eye. Richard sat up straighter, puffing out his arrogant chest to absorb glory. Preston then dramatically gestured toward Clara and DeAndre, who had desperately found uncomfortable seats at a secondary table. "And I must publicly acknowledge my brilliant sister Clara and my exceptional brother-in-law DeAndre Preston," continued, speaking, his voice dripping with sycophantic fake warmth. "Their unwavering daily counsel and brilliant financial oversight have been the guiding light of Next-Gen Solutions from the start. We are not just a corporate board, we are a completely united family. We fiercely protect each other, and we build incredible things together." I sat in my luxurious velvet chair, remaining perfectly still, absolutely quiet today. I slowly picked up my heavy crystal glass of sparkling water and took a slow, incredibly measured sip. The cool, sparkling liquid felt perfectly refreshing against my throat. I sat silently watching my older brother entirely erase my existence from his fabricated life story. He stood directly in front of the most powerful financial titans in America and painted a beautiful portrait of a flawless, supportive family unit, deliberately omitting the sister they had systematically abused and mercilessly discarded. He genuinely thought erasing me made him look incredibly strong. He did not realize his mistake was absolutely fatal right now. His decision to double down on these blatant, pathetic lies was simply providing the thick, heavy rope for his own very public execution. Preston clicked the small remote again. The bright family photograph vanished, quickly, replaced by a stark, bold graphic displaying astronomical growth charts and massive financial projections. We are currently living in a fast digital age that desperately craves authentic, meaningful connection. Preston pitched loudly, pacing the wide stage with forced theatrical, frantic energy. Next-Gen Solutions has finally cracked the universal code. Our proprietary algorithm does not just connect eager users across the entire globe, it also intuitively anticipates their collaborative needs with unprecedented speed. We have built an ecosystem experiencing exponential viral growth. Tonight, I am seeking a $50 million Series B investment, Preston announced boldly. This essential capital will be utilized to heavily scale our server infrastructure and execute aggressive global market expansion. Why are we asking for exactly $50 million today? Because the market has already validated our product in amazing ways. As of early this morning, Next-Gen Solutions has officially successfully crossed the massive threshold of 2 million daily active users, securely engaging on our proprietary platform directly right here and now. Preston paused to let the massive numbers sink into the minds of the investors. He smiled broadly, soaking in the polite applause before gesturing toward the secondary tables. "But rapid growth requires brilliant financial stewardship," Preston declared, his voice booming through the sound system. "To explain exactly how we plan to deploy this capital and maximize our revenue streams, I would like to invite our Chief Financial Officer to the stage. Please welcome DeAndre." DeAndre stood up from his seat, smoothing the front of his custom-tailored suit with an exaggerated air of supreme importance. He confidently strode down the center aisle, acting as if he had just conquered the entire financial world. He practically bounded up the short steps to the stage, taking the microphone from Preston with a firm, aggressive handshake. He turned to face the room of billionaires, resting his hands casually on the edges of the glass podium. DeAndre thrived in these specific high-pressure moments. He operated under the fundamental delusion that sounding incredibly complicated was the exact same thing as actually being intelligent. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." DeAndre began, his voice dripping with smooth, practiced corporate charm. When we look at the current trajectory of next-gen solutions, we are not simply looking at a traditional linear growth model. We are examining an unprecedented paradigm shift in digital engagement. To truly understand our valuation today, we need to look past the top-line revenue and dive deeply into our adjusted EBT metrics. DeAndre aggressively clicked the remote instantly, bringing up a new slide filled with chaotic, complex graphs and intentionally confusing data points designed to overwhelm the viewers immediately. "Our current burn rate is heavily optimized for aggressive scaling," DeAndre explained, pointing toward a steeply climbing green line on the massive screen. "While traditional startups bleed capital during their initial user acquisition phase, our proprietary algorithms have drastically reduced our customer acquisition cost. We are currently projecting a 30 times multiple on our annual recurring revenue by the end of Q4. This Series B capital injection will not just extend our runway, it will completely vaporize our competition. We are leveraging a dynamic SaaS model that practically guarantees massive profit margins while significantly decreasing our operational overhead." He continued to throw out a relentless barrage of heavy corporate jargon. He talked about synergistic integrations, holistic value propositions, and forward-looking liquidity events. He deliberately used dense, confusing language specifically designed to overwhelm the investors and create an impenetrable smoke screen of financial success. He painted a completely fraudulent picture of a company generating massive organic cash flow. In reality, they were hemorrhaging money faster than they could print it. DeAndre paced across the stage, projecting the image of a financial wizard effortlessly managing a wildly profitable tech empire while hiding devastating corporate liabilities from public view. He paused his pacing and turned his attention directly toward the VIP tables at the very front of the room. He let his gaze sweep across the billionaires before deliberately locking his arrogant eyes directly onto me. DeAndre smirked his chest, puffing out with overwhelming spiteful pride. "Now, I know that looking at these advanced financial models can be incredibly overwhelming for the average person." DeAndre announced, his voice echoing loudly through the massive ballroom. He leaned casually against the glass podium, crossing his ankles to demonstrate his supreme physical comfort and total dominance over the current situation. "In fact, some people might look at our complex EBITDA projections and feel entirely lost." He continued, refusing to break eye contact with me. "It takes a certain level of elite financial literacy to truly comprehend the magnitude of what we are building here today. Some people simply lack the basic education to grasp high economics. They might prefer to stick to simpler things like fetching coffee or taking notes because the adult conversations happening in this room are completely beyond their intellectual capacity." A few nervous, awkward chuckles rippled through the dining hall as the audience sensed the sudden, bizarre shift in tone. I sat perfectly still in my velvet chair. I did not glare. I did not frown. I simply stared back at him with an expression of absolute terrifying calm. I slowly lifted my heavy crystal glass of sparkling water and took another measured sip. I allowed DeAndre to bask in the glow of his own pathetic arrogance. He genuinely believed he had just publicly humiliated me in front of the most powerful people in Greenwich. He thought his corporate smoke screen was entirely impenetrable. He stood there grinning like a champion, completely unaware of the approaching financial apocalypse. He had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 3 months meticulously tearing apart every single fake spreadsheet he had ever created. I knew exactly where he hid the stolen money. I knew exactly which offshore accounts he used to siphon funds away from legitimate operations. I sat there in total silence, watching him desperately attempt to blind a room full of brilliant investors with cheap, flashy vocabulary. He dug his own grave deeper and deeper with every single word he spoke. The sheer audacity of his performance was genuinely breathtaking to witness in person today. DeAndre finished his presentation by aggressively clicking to the final slide, which displayed a massive requested investment figure in bold, bright green font. He spread his arms wide, embracing the room. NextGen Solutions is not just a company. He loudly proclaimed, his voice reaching a theatrical crescendo. It is a generational wealth creation vehicle, and we invite you to join us on this incredible journey to the absolute top of the market. He handed the microphone back to Preston, completely satisfied with his deceitful performance and entirely oblivious to the lethal trap closing tightly around his neck right now. The wealthy audience clapped politely for the two men standing on the stage. They believed the presentation was completely finished. They did not know the real financial reckoning was seconds away. The polite applause from the elite audience echoed off the marble walls of the grand ballroom. Investors clapped with the measured, restrained enthusiasm typical of the billionaire class. Preston and DeAndre stood proudly on the brightly lit stage, absorbing the sound like parched earth drinking in the rain. They smiled broadly, nodding to the crowd, convinced they had just secured their $50 million prize. But at the head of the main table, Harrison Caldwell did not join in the applause. He sat perfectly motionless. His large hands remained resting flat against the crisp white silk tablecloth. Harrison's stillness was a gravitational force. In a room full of powerful people, the man who controlled the capital dictated the atmosphere. Slowly, the polite applause began to falter. The clapping died out in waves, rolling from the front of the room all the way to the back. Investors lowered their hands, noticing that the billionaire host was completely unamused. The heavy silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Preston's smile faltered slightly. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing nervously at DeAndre. DeAndre adjusted his designer tie, looking highly confused by the sudden absolute quiet. Harrison leaned forward, slowly, deliberately pressing the button on the base of his tabletop microphone. A sharp, brief feedback ring cut through the tense air, ensuring every single person in the ballroom was paying absolute attention. "Thank you for that presentation, gentlemen," Harrison said. His voice was completely devoid of the warmth he had displayed earlier. It was flat, cold, and terrifyingly professional. "You have certainly painted a very ambitious picture of NextGen Solutions tonight. You have presented us with aggressive growth metrics and highly optimistic financial projections. It is certainly a compelling narrative you have crafted." Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly under the bright stage lights. He gripped the edge of the glass podium, trying to maintain his confident posture, but his knuckles were stark white. "We believe the data speaks for itself, Mr. Caldwell," Preston replied, his voice trembling just a fraction of an inch. Harrison did not respond to Preston. Instead, he slowly turned his luxurious velvet chair away from the stage. He shifted his entire physical focus to his right, locking his piercing gaze directly onto me, the spotlight operator. Noticing the major shift, immediately adjusted the brilliant white beam. The blinding light expanded, washing over my seat at the VIP table and illuminating the heavy black leather portfolio resting on the table in front of me. The entire room of 100 elite investors shifted their attention following Harrison lead. Every eye was now fixed firmly on me. However, as we all know in the venture capital business, Harrison continued, his voice echoing clearly through the massive speakers. "We never simply take a founder at their word. We verify. Naomi, as the independent auditor we hired for this quarter, what is your firm assessment of this startup?" The question dropped into the silent ballroom like a live grenade. The color drained from Preston's face so rapidly he looked as if he might pass out right there on the stage. His mouth fell open, forming a silent shape of absolute terror. He stared down at me, sitting in the guest of honor chair, bathed in the bright white spotlight. His eyes darted from my face to the black leather portfolio resting under my hands, the heavy portfolio he had forced me to carry from the car. The portfolio he thought contained his own fabricated pitch deck. The horrific reality finally crashed down on him. The sister he had commanded to stay in the shadows, the woman he had threatened and humiliated outside the estate, was not here as his pathetic assistant. She was the chief executive officer of the elite corporate intelligence firm hired to investigate him. She was his judge and his executioner. Preston staggered backward a full step, nearly tripping over the thick microphone cord. He looked at DeAndre, desperately seeking an escape route, but DeAndre was completely paralyzed, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. His arrogant corporate SmokeX screen had instantly evaporated. The wealthy investors in the room began to murmur loudly. High-profile executives leaned in, whispering furiously to one another. They were corporate sharks smelling fresh blood in the water. They instantly recognized the drastic, massive shift in power dynamics. Harrison Caldwell had not just asked a simple professional question. He had publicly handed over the reins of the execution to me. My mother, Diane, sat frozen at her secondary table, her face a mask of pale horror. My father, Richard, gripped the edge of his table, looking physically ill. Clara pressed her shaking hands over her mouth, realizing her husband was completely trapped. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute silence of my enemies. I did not rush myself. I let Preston stand there sweating and trembling under the harsh glare of the stage lights. I let him feel the crushing weight of his own profound stupidity. He had spent his entire life building an illusion of superiority, and in 10 seconds, that entire illusion had been shattered by a single question from a billionaire. I slowly unclasped the heavy brass lock on the front of my black leather portfolio. The crisp metallic click echoed loudly through the tense, quiet room. I deliberately opened the thick leather cover, revealing the 400-page forensic audit stacked neatly inside. The red seals of the federal agencies gleamed brightly under the spotlight. I placed my hands flat against the cool silk tablecloth. I looked up directly into Preston wide, terrified, completely desperate eyes. He silently pleaded with me, his gaze begging for ultimate mercy. He wanted the sister who had always stayed quiet to protect him one last time. But that sister was dead. I pushed my chair back, letting the solid, heavy wood scrape harshly against the marble floor, and stood up to deliver the final, absolute verdict today. I stood completely upright, smoothing the front of my dress with slow, deliberate movements. The entire room remained locked in a suffocating, breathless silence. 100 powerful investors watched my every single motion. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I did not need to shout to destroy the fragile illusion my brother had presented. True power in the corporate world is always delivered with lethal, quiet precision. I picked up the heavy forensic audit from the table, holding it so everyone could see the thick stack of damning evidence. Mr. Caldwell, I began, my voice carrying clearly across the vast ballroom. Aegis Intel was tasked with conducting a comprehensive due diligence investigation into next-gen solutions. Our primary objective was to verify the structural integrity and market valuation metrics presented by the founders. I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the crowd before locking eyes with Preston. What we uncovered was not a revolutionary digital platform. We uncovered a meticulously constructed house of cards built entirely on fraudulent data. Preston gripped the glass podium so tightly his knuckles turned a sickly shade of white. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw breath under the blinding stage lights. Naomi, he stammered, his voice cracking pitifully. Naomi, please do not do this. You have misunderstood the internal metrics. I ignored his pathetic plea completely. I opened the black leather portfolio and retrieved the first printed exhibit. Let us address the core valuation metric that Mr. Hayes just proudly announced to this room. I continued speaking with cold, unwavering authority. He stood on this stage 5 minutes ago and explicitly requested $50 million based on the guarantee that NextG Solutions has successfully secured 2 million daily active users. He claimed this user base represents massive organic market penetration. I held up a detailed geographical heat map on high-quality glossy paper. I turned it so the investors at the primary tables could see the massive clusters of red dots concentrated entirely outside the United States. Our forensic cybersecurity team ran a deep packet inspection on the server architecture currently utilized by NextGen Solutions. I explained, projecting my voice so the executives in the back row could hear every single devastating syllable. We bypassed their front-end dashboard and directly analyzed their raw traffic logs. The data is entirely unequivocal. Of the 2 million daily active users claimed by this startup, exactly 1.8 million are completely fabricated. They are not human beings engaging with a revolutionary communication ecosystem. They are automated scripts generated by massive commercial bot farms physically located in St. Petersburg. Russia. A collective gasp rippled through the dining hall. The polite, wealthy restraint of the Greenwich elite shattered instantly. Billionaires and hedge fund managers began whispering furiously to one another, leaning across the white silk tablecloths to exchange horrified glances. The sound of their murmuring grew into an angry, buzzing hive. They realized they had almost handed over $50 million to a man selling them digital smoke. This was not a minor accounting error or an aggressive marketing projection. This was deliberate, calculated criminal fraud executed on a massive scale. Harrison Caldwell leaned forward in his velvet chair, stapling his fingers together as he watched my brother squirm. My firm traced the dark web transactions executed by NextGen Solutions. Over the past 9 months, I stated relentlessly delivering blow after blow without a single ounce of mercy. We secured the digital receipts proving that Mr. Hayes authorized the purchase of these bot farms using early-stage investor capital. He deliberately funneled money to overseas cyber criminals, specifically to create a massive surge of fake traffic right before this funding round. He paid for phantom users to artificially inflate the company valuation, knowing perfectly well that the platform itself is a ghost town. The platform has barely 200,000 real users, and that number is rapidly declining. Preston's face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate panic. He released his death grip on the podium and threw his hands up in the air, frantically shaking his head. "It is a glitch," he stammered loudly, trying to speak over the angry buzzing of the investor crowd. "The server logs are just experiencing a routing glitch. We recently migrated our databases to a new cloud infrastructure, and the IP addresses were scrambled during the transfer. Naomi is just an external auditor. She does not understand the highly complex technical architecture of our back-end systems. It is just a temporary anomaly. I swear." His voice cracked on the final word, echoing pathetically through the ballroom sound system. He sounded like a cornered rat, desperately chewing through steel wire. The investors did not buy his ridiculous excuse for a single second. Men who manage billion-dollar portfolios do not fall for tales of mysterious routing glitches. I pulled out a second document from my folder. This one was a printed email chain featuring glaring red highlight marks. It is remarkably bold to claim a system glitch. "Mr. Hayes," I countered, my tone dropping to a freezing, lethal whisper. "Especially when we recovered your completely deleted internal corporate communications from your highly secure servers." I held the printed emails up high for the wealthy crowd to witness clearly. "I have right here an encrypted email thread from 3 weeks ago where your lead back-end developer explicitly warned you about the Russian bot traffic. He told you it was illegal and threatened to resign immediately. Your written response to him was a direct order to bury the traffic source data before the Caldwell Ventures audit team arrived. You explicitly commanded your engineering team to hide the fraud. I placed the documents back onto the table. The entire room grew quiet as the reality of the situation settled. The silence in the room returned, but it was no longer shocked. It was the heavy, furious silence of powerful people who realized they had been deeply insulted. The oppressive quiet was suddenly broken by the aggressive scraping of a chair against the polished marble floor. DeAndre leapt to his feet from his secondary table. He furiously buttoned his designer suit jacket and marched toward the center aisle, projecting a false aura of supreme corporate authority. He could not stand by and watch his golden ticket evaporate into thin air tonight. He mistakenly believed his sophisticated financial vocabulary could somehow rescue them from hard, undeniable forensic evidence. "Listen to me very closely," DeAndre commanded, his voice booming with arrogant condescension as he pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "You are stepping way outside your lane. Naomi, you are an external auditor who clearly does not understand how to properly read a sophisticated venture capital balance sheet. You are completely misinterpreting standard international marketing expenditures and confusing them with malicious illegal activity." He looked around at the billionaire investors, flashing a desperate, overly confident smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, please do not let this disgruntled former student confuse you with out-of-context internal emails. We have fully optimized our user acquisition pipeline. The capital flow is completely transparent to anyone who actually possesses a fundamental understanding of modern high-growth startup economics. Naomi is simply projecting her own financial illiteracy onto our complex business model because she lacks the basic education required to comprehend our adjusted earnings." I slowly turned my head and locked my eyes directly onto DeAndre. I did not blink. I did not betray a single ounce of intimidation. His desperate attempt to gaslight a room full of elite financial experts using generic corporate buzzwords was genuinely pathetic. I picked up a new heavy stack of documents from my open black leather portfolio. The thick, crisp pages rustled sharply in the quiet ballroom. Financial literacy. DeAndre. I repeated his phrase, letting the words hang in the air with freezing, lethal precision. That is a truly fascinating choice of words coming from a chief financial officer who has spent the last 8 months actively cooking the corporate books. The confident smirk completely vanished from DeAndre's face. He froze in the center of the aisle, his hand dropping awkwardly to his side. "You stand here lecturing me about balance sheets while simultaneously running one of the most sloppy amateur embezzlement schemes my firm has ever had the absolute displeasure of tracking." I continued, my voice rising with absolute, undeniable authority. "You truly thought your corporate jargon could hide the massive, gaping holes in your cash flow. But forensic accounting does not care about your empty buzzwords. DeAndre, math simply does not lie. And your math is spectacularly incriminating." I held up a dense spreadsheet covered entirely in thick red markers. I turned it slowly so Harrison Caldwell could see the final highlighted column clearly. "Let us discuss your highly optimized capital flow," I announced, projecting my voice so the furious executives in the very back could hear the impending execution. According to the original series, A. Funding documents. NextGen Solutions raised $10 million specifically for product development and domestic marketing. But my skilled team noticed a massive, glaring discrepancy in your vendor payments over the past 2 fiscal quarters. I pulled a specific bank statement from the stack. Over the past 6 months, exactly $4 million of early investor capital was deliberately diverted away from domestic operations. DeAndre took a step backward, his chest heaving rapidly under his custom suit. "You illegally funneled that $4 million into a newly established offshore shell company," I stated ruthlessly, delivering the ultimate blow. "You registered a phantom entity called Apex Global Holdings located secretly in the Cayman Islands. You intentionally categorized these massive wire transfers as consulting fees and overseas marketing expenses to easily bypass standard financial compliance checks." I looked down at the highlighted bank record and began reading aloud, for the immense benefit of the investors sitting in this room. Let me read the exact routing numbers associated directly with this fraudulent Cayman account. Routing number 02 1000089. Account number 4759823100. I looked back up, making direct, unbroken eye contact with DeAndre. The primary beneficiary and sole legal signatory on that offshore account is not NextGen Solutions. The sole signatory is you, DeAndre, along with my brother Preston. You deliberately stole $4 million from your initial investors and parked it securely in a tax haven so you could fund your lavish personal lifestyles while your fake company slowly bled to death. The devastating reality hit the dining room like a massive physical shockwave. The wealthy investors erupted into loud, furious shouting. Several powerful board members slammed their fists aggressively onto the white silk tablecloths, expressing their sheer, unadulterated outrage. They were completely livid. DeAndre physically crumbled under the immense, overwhelming pressure. The arrogant, confident chief financial officer who had deeply insulted me just an hour ago completely vanished into thin air. His weak knees entirely gave out. He collapsed heavily into his chair, missing the cushion slightly and sliding awkwardly downward. His expensive suit suddenly looked like a cheap, wrinkled costume. He buried his sweating face in his violently trembling hands, realizing instantly that his entire professional career was completely over. He would absolutely never work in high finance again. He was actively looking at severe federal prison time. Preston stood totally frozen on the brightly lit stage, entirely speechless as his wicked co-conspirator broke down, weeping in front of the Greenwich elite. The investors surrounding his table physically backed away from him in sheer disgust. They treated him like a highly contagious disease. His pathetic weeping echoed softly beneath the roar of the furious crowd, demanding immediate answers. The magnificent corporate illusion he had so arrogantly paraded around all evening was completely shattered into a million tiny, jagged pieces. Justice had finally arrived tonight, and it was absolutely, completely merciless in its incredibly precise execution today. The chaos erupting across the dining room was deafening. Enraged billionaires and venture capitalists aggressively demanded immediate answers from the men on the stage. The lavish gala instantly transformed into a tribunal, amidst the roar of the wealthy elite. Another sound pierced the heavy atmosphere. It was a loud scraping of wooden chairs pushed back against the marble floor. I did not have to look away from the podium to know who was making that desperate noise. My toxic parents, Diane and Richard, had finally broken out of their paralyzed state. They could not sit back and watch their golden child face the undeniable consequences of his criminal actions. Their pathetic identity was intrinsically tied to his fabricated success. If Preston fell from his pedestal, they would crash down alongside him. Diane leapt out of her seat with the frantic energy of an unhinged woman. She ignored all protocols of high society etiquette, shoving past two respected hedge fund managers in the aisle. She marched directly toward the VIP table, her face contorted into a terrifying mask of absolute fury and blind denial. Richard followed closely behind her, his face slick with nervous sweat, his hands trembling visibly as he desperately tried to project parental authority he had lost decades ago. They ignored the mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence I presented to the room. They did not care about the fabricated user metrics or stolen offshore funds. They only cared about protecting the fragile delusion they were ripped their entire lives. "Naomi, stop this right now!" Diane shrieked, her shrill voice echoing sharply over the angry murmurs of the stunned investors. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face, disregarding the presence of Harrison Caldwell sitting right next to me. "You are a disgusting, jealous liar. You are making up these ridiculous, horrific stories just to ruin your brother and his big night. You have always been incredibly bitter about his success, and now you are trying to destroy his entire life in front of these important people." I sat perfectly still in my velvet chair, looking up at the woman who spent 33 years destroying my self-worth. I did not raise my voice or show any intimidation. I let her scream. I let her expose her true toxic nature to a room full of powerful people. The investors who had been shouting moments ago suddenly grew quiet, watching this bizarre family meltdown unfold with morbid fascination. They looked at Diane with profound disgust, watching a mother viciously attack the person who saved them from losing $50 million. "You are deeply embarrassing yourself, mother," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal whisper that carried clearly across the sudden silence of the room. The forensic data is undeniable. Your son is a criminal, and your son-in-law is an accomplice. They are brilliant visionaries, Diane screamed back, completely unhinged, refusing to accept a word of truth. Preston is an absolute genius. He has worked tirelessly to build a revolutionary company from the ground up. You could not even finish a basic college degree. Naomi, you are nothing but an ungrateful failure who could never achieve what your brother has accomplished. You are deliberately twisting normal business practices to make him look bad because you are terrified of him. Richard stepped forward, placing a shaking hand on Diane's shoulder in a pathetic attempt to calm her down, while backing up her delusional narrative. "Please listen to us. Everyone," Richard pleaded, looking frantically around the ballroom at the disgusted faces of the venture capitalists. "Our daughter has always been incredibly troubled and prone to telling malicious lies. She has a long history of trying to sabotage family events out of pure spite. You cannot trust a single document she brought tonight. This entire presentation is a vindictive personal attack generated by an unstable individual. The sheer audacity of their blind defense was genuinely breathtaking to witness. They were actively attempting to gaslight a room containing 100 elite financial experts. They genuinely believed their pathetic parental lies could somehow override detailed forensic bank statements and recovered encrypted emails. But Diane was not finished. In her frantic scramble to elevate Preston and destroy my credibility, she decided to proudly reveal the ultimate secret she had harbored. She wanted to prove to the room how deeply they believed in their golden son. "We believe in Preston so much that we put everything on the line for him," Diane declared, her voice ringing with twisted pride. "We took out a massive second mortgage on our family home to provide him with the essential seed capital he needed to launch this platform. We willingly gave him every penny of our life savings because we know exactly who he is. He is the only one in this family truly destined for absolute greatness. We proudly sacrificed everything for his vision because we know he will change the world." She stood there breathing heavily, staring at me with a triumphant, hateful glare. She genuinely believed her grand declaration of financial sacrifice would prove Preston's innocence and shame me into silence. She thought she had just delivered the perfect defense of her precious golden child. She expected the investors to nod in understanding and applaud their fierce, unwavering parental loyalty. Instead, the entire ballroom fell into a silence so incredibly thick, it felt like physical pressure. The wealthy executives stared at my parents with a mixture of profound pity and horror. They were looking at two deeply delusional people who bankrupted themselves to fund a criminal enterprise. I looked at Diane, flushed, triumphant face, and Richard, nervous, sweating brow. I looked at Preston, standing completely frozen on the stage, his eyes wide with impending doom. He knew exactly what was coming next. He knew that his mother, arrogant boast, had just handed me the final lethal weapon I needed to finish this execution. I slowly picked up the last folder from the table. The heavy manila envelope felt entirely weightless in my hands, compared to the massive psychological burden it was about to lift off my shoulders forever. I did not feel a single ounce of empathy as I looked down at my parents. Diane stood there with her chest heaving heavily, breathing in the stale air of her own manufactured delusions. Richard gripped the back of a nearby chair, tightly trying to anchor himself to a reality that was rapidly dissolving into absolute nothingness. They stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, fully believing their grand declaration of financial sacrifice had shielded their precious son from my corporate execution. They genuinely thought their unconditional parental love was a magic shield that could deflect federal crimes and forensic evidence. They were completely wrong. I opened the folder, deliberately taking my time. The wealthy investors in the grand ballroom leaned forward, collectively holding their breath. "You took out a second mortgage, Diane," I said, my voice projecting a freezing, terrifying calm that chilled the entire room. "You proudly leveraged the family home because you believed in your brilliant son. You thought you signed standard banking paperwork to provide him with a legitimate safety net. You truly believed you were funding his destiny for absolute greatness." I pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from the folder, holding it up so the bright spotlight illuminated the dense legal text. But that is not what actually happened, is it? Preston. I shifted my gaze back to the brightly lit stage. Preston physically recoiled as if my words were physical blows striking his chest. He shook his head frantically, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading panic. He knew exactly what documents I was holding in my right hand. He had spent the last 8 months desperately trying to hide this exact paperwork from everyone he knew. "You did not take out a standard second mortgage. Mom," I continued speaking with lethal corporate precision, "the documents you thought you signed were completely discarded the moment you left the room. What actually happened is that your golden child realized his failing startup needed significantly more capital to maintain his lavish lifestyle and his fraudulent Russian-bought farms. So he went behind your back. He bypassed the legitimate banking institutions because they required actual proof of revenue. Instead, your genius son went directly to a highly predatory, unregulated private lending firm." Diane frowned deeply, her forehead wrinkling in profound confusion. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice losing its aggressive edge and replacing it with creeping uncertainty. "We signed the mortgage papers at the bank with Preston. We authorized the loan." "You authorized a basic line of credit," I corrected her smoothly. "But the document I am holding right now is a massive high-interest predatory loan agreement for $3 million. And the most fascinating part about this specific legal contract is the signature page at the very bottom." I turned the document around, pointing directly to the bottom right corner where 2 distinct signatures rested on the dotted lines. I hired an independent forensic handwriting expert to verify these specific signatures before I arrived tonight. The results were entirely conclusive. Your golden child did not just ruin his company tonight. He committed blatant felony identity theft. Preston forged both of your signatures to secure this predatory loan against your property. A collective gasp echoed across the dining hall. The billionaire investors stared at Preston with absolute, undisguised revulsion. Forging documents to steal from your own parents was a new level of depravity, even for the ruthless corporate sharks in this room. Diane's face turned the color of wet ash. She slowly turned her head to look at Preston standing on the stage. Preston could not even meet her gaze. He looked down at his expensive leather shoes, completely paralyzed by his own exposed guilt. "He forged our signatures," Richard whispered, his voice cracking with absolute devastation. "He stole our house. It gets substantially worse." "Dad," I said, refusing to offer them a single shred of comfort. "Because Preston Company has generated absolutely zero legitimate revenue. He completely drained the initial capital in less than 6 months. He missed his first major payment. Then he missed his second payment. Exactly 60 days ago, this massive predatory loan officially went into catastrophic default." Diane began to hyperventilate. Her hands clutched frantically at the fabric of her sequined gown. "Default," she gasped, her eyes darting wildly around the room. "No, that cannot be true. Preston promised us the house was completely safe. He promised us we would be millionaires by Christmas. He lied to you." "Diane," I stated ruthlessly, delivering the ultimate blow. When the loan defaulted, the predatory lending firm immediately initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings. They quietly placed the seized debt asset on the private distressed market to recoup their massive financial losses. They auctioned off the legal deed to your home to the highest bidder. I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a single crisp piece of heavy parchment paper bearing a golden official county seal. I bought the debt. Mom, I announced, my voice echoing with chilling, absolute finality. When the private equity firm listed the defaulted loan, I used my own corporate capital to purchase it completely outright. I am holding the legal deed in my hand right now. I am the sole legal owner of your house, and Preston lost it. The devastating reality slammed into Diane like a runaway freight train. Her psychological delusion instantly shattered. The golden sun she worshipped had deliberately robbed her blind, leaving her completely destitute. Diane let out a horrifying, strangled gasp. Her eyes rolled back as her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed, fainting straight backward into Richard's waiting arms. Richard staggered under her dead weight, letting out a loud cry of panic. Preston watched in total, ultimate, silent, terrifying defeat today. The dull thud of Diane collapsing against Richard echoed through the stunned ballroom. Richard staggered under the sudden weight of his unconscious wife, lowering her awkwardly to the polished marble floor. He looked around wildly, shouting for a medic, his face a portrait of complete and utter despair. He was a man who had just lost his home, his savings, and his favorite son, all in the span of 5 minutes. But while Richard knelt on the floor, cradling Diane, the real explosion was brewing just a few feet away. Clara had been standing perfectly still since I read the routing numbers for the offshore accounts. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the space where her perfect, luxurious life used to be. The diamond necklace resting against her collarbone suddenly looked like a heavy chain holding her down. Her mind, which usually only processed country club invitations and designer brands, was rapidly calculating the devastating legal reality of her situation. She was legally married to the chief financial officer of a fraudulent company. They filed joint tax returns, the house they lived in, the cars they drove. The expensive vacations they took were all funded by the stolen $4 million sitting in that Cayman Islands shell company. When the federal authorities froze DeAndre and his assets, they would freeze hers, too. She was going to lose absolutely everything. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her perfectly manicured facade cracked and fell away, leaving behind a raw, terrified, and vicious woman. Clara slowly turned her head to look at her husband. DeAndre was still slumped in his chair, his head buried in his hands, completely paralyzed by his exposed crimes. He looked pathetic. He looked weak. And to Clara, weakness was the ultimate unforgivable sin. She had only married him for his money and his prestige. Now he had neither. DeAndre, Clara whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying, dark energy. Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not put our entire lives into an illegal offshore account. You absolute fool. DeAndre slowly looked up at his wife. His face was covered in a thick layer of cold sweat. His arrogant corporate swagger was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic, darting eyes of a cornered criminal. Clara, baby. Listen to me, he stammered, holding his hands up in a desperate, placating gesture. We can fix this. We just need to optimize our legal defense and leverage a restructuring strategy. It is just a temporary liquidity crisis. We can pivot. Do not you dare pitch me, you pathetic fraud. Clara shrieked, her voice tearing through the silent ballroom like a siren. She lunged forward, grabbing the lapels of his custom-tailored suit. She yanked him upward with surprising strength. Her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure feral rage. You leveraged our lives. You used my name on those tax returns. The federal government is going to seize my bank accounts. They are going to take my home. You dragged me into a federal financial conspiracy so you could pretend to be a venture capital genius. You are nothing but a cheap thief wearing an expensive watch. Clara released his lapels and violently shoved him backward. DeAndre stumbled, crashing hard into the edge of the secondary table and sending a silver tray of crystal glasses shattering onto the floor. He scrambled to find his footing, trying to hush his screaming wife. But Clara was completely beyond reason. The survival instinct had taken over, and she was ready to sacrifice anyone to save herself. She whipped around her furious gaze, locking onto Preston, who was still standing frozen on the brightly lit stage. "You!" Clara screamed, pointing an accusing, shaking finger directly at her older brother. "You dragged us into this. You begged DeAndre to cook the books because your stupid platform was a massive failure from day one. You promised us we would be billionaires. You promised us stock options and generational wealth. Instead, you turned my husband into a federal criminal to cover up your pathetic incompetence." Preston's face turned bright red as his own survival instinct finally kicked in. He gripped the glass podium and leaned forward, shouting back at his sister in front of the horrified investors. "Shut your mouth, Clara," Preston roared, his voice cracking with panic and absolute fury. DeAndre was the one who suggested the Cayman accounts. He is the financial officer. He set up the shell companies and wired the stolen money. I did not force your husband to embezzle investor funds. He did it because you demanded a bigger house and a better lifestyle. You spent the stolen money just as fast as we did. You are just as guilty as we are. I am not going to prison for your lies," Clara screeched, marching toward the front of the stage like a rabid animal. "I am calling my lawyers right now. I am going to testify against both of you. I will tell the authorities everything. I will give them every single password and every hidden ledger if it keeps me out of a federal cell." "You treacherous little snake," Preston yelled back, spitting his words with pure venom. "You happily took the money when you thought we were winning. Now you want to play the victim. You are nothing without me." DeAndre finally found his voice, launching himself into the vicious fray to attack Preston. "You arrogant fool!" DeAndre shouted, pointing up at the stage. "I spent months covering your tracks because you decided to buy 2 million fake Russian bots without consulting me. You created the initial fraud. I was just trying to stop the entire company from bleeding to death. You ruined my career." The three of them devolved into a brutal screaming match right in the middle of the billionaire gala. They tore each other apart with absolute viciousness, hurling terrible accusations and exposing even more of their dirty secrets to the entire room. They fought like starving wolves, fighting over a rotting carcass, throwing each other under the bus in a desperate, pathetic bid for survival. The illusion of the perfect supportive American family was completely shattered into a million jagged, irredeemable pieces. I sat perfectly still at the head table, sipping my sparkling water as I watched them destroy each other. I did not intervene. I did not smile. I simply let the poison they had cultivated for decades finally consume them. The wealthy investors watched the implosion with wide, horrified eyes, completely disgusted by the feral display of betrayal and greed happening right in front of them. The beautiful, carefully curated aesthetic of their privileged lives had burned away, leaving only the ugly, raw reality of their toxic existence exposed for the entire world to judge. The execution was magnificent, and it was absolutely, totally complete. Preston watched his family burn, and his sanity finally snapped under the pressure. He stood alone on the brightly lit stage, watching the total devastation of his entire existence. The $50 million he had essentially tasted just 20 minutes ago had completely vanished into thin air. The lavish lifestyle, the expensive cars, the prestige, and the arrogant corporate identity he had constructed were entirely gone. In their place stood the terrifyingly real prospect of a lengthy federal prison sentence. Preston looked down at the screaming match happening below him. Clara was threatening to turn state evidence against DeAndre. His mother lay unconscious on the cold marble floor. His father was weeping openly in front of the most powerful financial titans in the country. Everything Preston had ever cared about was burning to ash right before his eyes. His mind, unable to process the absolute totality of his failure, simply broke. His sanity fractured, leaving only pure primal desperation. His frantic, shifting gaze finally left the humiliating family brawl and locked directly onto me. He did not see a sister sitting at the head table. He saw the architect of his total ruin. More importantly, he saw the heavy black leather portfolio in the shattered reality of a desperate narcissist. He actually believed that destroying the physical documents would somehow erase his crimes. He convinced himself that if he could just get his hands on that forensic audit, he could rip it to shreds and magically make the federal indictment disappear. A guttural animalistic roar erupted from his chest. It was a horrifying sound completely devoid of human reason. Preston launched himself off the elevated stage. He did not bother using the stairs. He leapt directly over the edge, landing heavily on the polished marble floor. His expensive rented tuxedo jacket tore at the shoulder seam as he stumbled forward. But he did not care. He recovered his footing and began sprinting furiously down the wide center aisle. He charged directly toward the VIP table, his eyes bulging with a violent psychotic rage. His face was a terrifying mask of sweat and pure hatred. The wealthy investors seated along the aisle scrambled backward in absolute terror. Billionaires and hedge fund managers shoved their velvet chairs out of the way, desperately trying to avoid the path of a completely unhinged man. Preston shoved past a highly respected tech executive, knocking the older man into a silver champagne bucket. He kept charging forward, his arms outstretched, his fingers hooked into rigid claws. He wanted the portfolio, but he also wanted to physically destroy me. He wanted to punish me for daring to hold up a mirror to his pathetic, fraudulent reality. I sat perfectly motionless in my chair. I did not scream. I did not flinch. I did not even raise my hands to defend myself. I simply watched his pathetic, desperate sprint with the cold, clinical detachment of an observer watching a spectacular car crash. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Billionaires like Harrison Caldwell do not host elite gatherings of the most powerful financial figures in the country without an absolute fortress of invisible security. I had already noticed the broad-shouldered men wearing discreet earpieces stationed at strategic points around the grand ballroom. I knew Preston would never even make it close enough to touch the edge of my silk tablecloth. "Give it to me," Preston screamed, his voice echoing violently through the cavernous dining hall. "Give me the file. Naomi, I will kill you. I will absolutely kill you." He was exactly 3 feet away from my chair. I could see the frantic, crazed desperation in his bloodshot eyes. I could smell the sharp, sour scent of his panic. He lunged his right hand, reaching aggressively for the black leather portfolio resting on the table. He never even grazed the leather. From the shadows near the kitchen entrance and the corners of the VIP section, 3 massive security operatives moved with terrifying synchronized speed. They did not shout warnings. They executed a flawlessly coordinated tactical takedown. The largest security guard, a man built like a concrete wall, intercepted Preston in mid-stride. He grabbed my brother by the collar of his torn tuxedo jacket and the belt of his trousers. The forward momentum of Preston's desperate charge was instantly halted. The guard lifted Preston completely off his feet, turning his body with brutal, ruthless efficiency. The second guard stepped forward and assisted in driving Preston downward. They slammed him violently onto the surface of a heavy mahogany secondary table positioned just left of the VIP section. The physical impact was deafening. The heavy wood groaned under the immense sudden weight. A towering centerpiece of white orchids and silver candelabras tipped over, crashing onto the floor. Dozens of delicate crystal wine glasses and porcelain dinner plates shattered simultaneously. The sharp, piercing sound of breaking glass rang out like a chaotic symphony of absolute destruction. Shards of crystal rained down across the marble floor as the table violently shook. Preston screamed in sudden, agonizing pain as the breath was forcefully knocked out of his lungs. The security guards pinned him face down against the polished mahogany wood. One guard pressed a heavy knee firmly into the center of Preston's back, completely immobilizing his spine. Another guard grabbed Preston's right arm, twisting it sharply behind his back and securing his wrist with a ruthless grip. Preston thrashed wildly against the solid wood, kicking his legs and spitting furiously, but he was completely trapped. His expensive rented suit was now soaked in spilled red wine and covered in the crushed petals of white orchids. He was entirely subdued, rendered utterly powerless in front of the exact investors he had tried to impress. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. I slowly extended my right hand. I picked up my heavy crystal glass of sparkling water from the pristine white tablecloth. I raised the glass to my lips and took a perfectly measured sip. I set it down. Preston was gasping for air against the polished mahogany, his cheek pressed firmly into a pool of spilled wine. The security operatives held him with unrelenting pressure. They were waiting for the final act of this corporate tragedy to unfold completely. Suddenly, the massive double oak doors at the primary entrance of the ballroom swung open with a heavy, synchronized thud. The sound echoed like a judge striking a gavel. The investors turned their heads in absolute unison. It was not the local police. It was not the estate security staff. A highly tactical team of exactly 12 men and women strode into the opulent room. The bold yellow letters of the FBI and SEC were clearly printed across the heavy tactical windbreakers of the lead agents. They moved with absolute terrifying military precision. Their heavy boots marched aggressively against the pristine marble floors, entirely disrupting the refined atmosphere of the billionaire gala. The lead agent, a tall, imposing woman with steel gray hair and a stern face, raised a gold badge high into the air for everyone to see. Nobody moved, delayed. Agent announced, her voice booming across the grand dining hall with absolute authority. "We are securing this entire location immediately. All exits are currently locked down by federal authorities. Do not attempt to leave your seats." A fresh wave of shock rippled through the wealthy audience. Clara screamed and scrambled backward, her expensive high heels slipping on the slick marble floor. She desperately attempted to distance herself from DeAndre, who was still slumped in his chair, sweating profusely and staring blankly at the approaching agents. Richard, still kneeling beside the unconscious Diane, looked up at the federal team with eyes completely devoid of hope. His entire world had officially ended tonight. Harrison Caldwell remained seated next to me, his posture completely relaxed. He casually adjusted his diamond cufflinks, watching the federal authorities flood his private estate. He knew they were coming. We had meticulously coordinated this precise entry schedule earlier this afternoon to ensure maximum impact. Preston struggled weakly against the heavy hands of the security guards. "What is this?" he choked out, spitting blood and wine from his busted lip onto the table. "Naomi, what did you do?" "You called the cops on your own, brother." I stood up slowly, making sure my voice would project clearly across the cavernous room. I looked down at Preston, ensuring he understood his absolute destruction. I did not call the local police over a petty family dispute. Preston, I declared, my voice ringing with lethal corporate authority. I am a highly licensed corporate auditor. I am the chief executive officer of Aegis Intel. When my firm accepts a lucrative contract to conduct financial due diligence, we are legally bound by a strict fiduciary duty. When my forensic team uncovered your massive web of wire fraud, offshore embezzlement, and deliberate securities manipulation, I did not have a choice. I was legally obligated to report your criminal enterprise to federal authorities immediately to prevent further financial damage to innocent investors. The investors in the room nodded in grim understanding. They knew exactly how federal corporate laws worked. They deeply respected the cold, calculating efficiency of the strike. You deliberately falsified user acquisition metrics to secure $50 million across state lines. I continued pacing slowly near the edge of the glass podium. You forged official signatures to secure predatory loans. DeAndre illegally transferred $4 million of early investor capital into a Cayman Islands shell company. Those are not simple family secrets. Preston, those are severe federal crimes carrying decades of prison time. I did not just ruin your pitch tonight. I triggered a massive federal indictment that will dismantle your entire life. DeAndre let out a pathetic whimpering sob. The federal agents immediately surrounded his secondary table. 2 agents firmly grabbed his arms, dragging him roughly out of his expensive chair. He did not even attempt to resist the arrest. His legs completely buckled beneath him, and the agents had to physically support his dead weight as they pulled his shaking arms behind his back. Preston thrashed wildly against the mahogany table, his panic mutating into absolute hysteria. "You cannot do this to me!" Preston screamed, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, desperate wail. "I am your brother. We are blood. Mom and Dad gave everything for me. You are destroying our family." I walked around the long table and stood directly above him. I looked down into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. My expression remained entirely devoid of any sympathy or familial warmth. "You destroyed this family a long time ago," I replied softly, my tone freezing the air between us. "You built your entire pathetic identity by standing directly on my neck. You ruthlessly stole my future to fund your delusions of grandeur. Mom and Dad gladly handed you the knife to do it. You thought you were absolutely invincible because they aggressively protected you from every single consequence. But they cannot protect you from the federal government. Preston, the real world does not care about your golden child status. The real world only cares about the hard data. And your data is a massive federal crime." The lead FBI agent approached the mahogany table. She signaled the private security guards to release their tight hold. The moment the guards stepped back, 2 federal agents grabbed Preston by his torn velvet tuxedo jacket. They hauled him upright with brutal efficiency, ignoring his pathetic cries for mercy. Preston Hayes, the lead agent, stated, her voice carrying the absolute crushing weight of the United States justice system. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, and aggravated identity theft." He just stared at me, tears streaming down his bruised face. Finally realizing that the sister he always treated like absolute garbage was the one securely locking his federal cage forever. The meticulously planned federal raid was executing perfectly exactly as I had originally envisioned today. The heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut around Preston's wrists echoed violently across the silent grand ballroom. The federal agent secured his arms tightly behind his back, completely stripping away the last remaining shreds of his carefully manufactured dignity. The lead agent pulled him upright with a rough, unapologetic yank. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent began her voice, cutting through the thick, heavy air of the dining hall with absolute mechanical precision. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The iconic words of the Miranda warning, usually reserved for television dramas, were now broadcasting live in the center of the most exclusive estate in Greenwich. Preston stumbled forward, his expensive rented velvet tuxedo completely ruined. The crushed white orchids and spilled red wine clung to his fabric, marking him like a branded criminal. He kept twisting his neck, trying to look back at me. But the federal agents aggressively forced his head forward. He was weeping openly now, his shoulders shaking as the reality of a 10-year federal prison sentence finally crushed his fragile narcissistic ego. At the secondary table, DeAndre was receiving the exact same ruthless treatment. 2 massive agents hauled the chief financial officer out of his chair. DeAndre designer's suit hung awkwardly on his trembling frame. He did not fight back. He simply stared blankly ahead, completely catatonic, as the cold steel bracelets locked securely around his wrists. Clara had collapsed completely onto the polished marble floor. She was scrambling backward away from her arrested husband, her luxury designer gown twisting awkwardly around her legs. She was sobbing hysterically, her chest heaving with frantic gasps for air. Her perfect, flawless makeup was entirely ruined, running down her face in thick, dark streaks. She reached out her shaking hands, not to comfort DeAndre, but to actively push him away as the agents marched him past her. "Do not touch me!" Clara shrieked, her voice cracking with pure terror. I had absolutely nothing to do with those offshore accounts. I did not know he was stealing the money. I am innocent. Please do not freeze my bank accounts. She was actively begging the federal agents, desperately trying to sever her legal ties to the man she had proudly flaunted all evening. Her loyalty evaporated the exact second her financial security vanished. The agents completely ignored her pathetic pleas. They treated her like background noise, methodically processing the crime scene and securing the primary suspects. Clara slammed her fists against the cold floor, wailing in absolute agony as she realized her entire upper-class existence was officially over. The country club memberships, the luxury vacations, and the fake prestige were all being seized by the federal government tonight. My mother, Diane, could not accept the brutal reality playing out in front of her. She scrambled away from Richard, shaking arms, and threw herself into the center of the aisle. Her eyes were completely wild, frantically darting between the federal agents and the extremely wealthy investors sitting at the primary tables. She targeted Harrison Caldwell and the surrounding venture capitalists, launching herself forward with her hands clasped together in a desperate begging motion. "Please, Diane," wailed, her shrill voice breaking as she approached a group of powerful hedge fund managers. "You have to help my son. You have all the money and the power. You can make this go away. Tell them it was just a simple misunderstanding. He is a brilliant boy. He is a good man. He just made a tiny mistake. We will pay everything back. Please do not let them take my golden boy away." She reached out to grab the sleeve of a prominent tech investor. The billionaire violently recoiled, snatching his arm back as if Diane were covered in toxic waste. The wealthy elite turned their backs on her in absolute total disgust. They shielded their wives and partners, stepping away from the hysterical woman, begging on the floor. Harrison Caldwell did not even look at her. He simply raised his hand, signaling his private security team to step forward and form a protective barrier between the billionaires and my frantic mother. Diane fell to her knees, weeping loudly into her hands, realizing that the high society she desperately worshipped was actively rejecting her like a diseased animal. I stood perfectly tall at the front of the room, absorbing the absolute chaos with a completely cold, unyielding gaze. I watched the men who had relentlessly belittled me for my entire life being physically marched out of the grand ballroom in heavy steel handcuffs. Preston was dragged down the main center aisle, his head hanging in total defeat. He passed the exact spot where he had threatened me earlier tonight. He passed the overflow table where Clara had aggressively ordered me to sit. Every single step he took toward the massive exit doors was a permanent nail in the coffin of his fake empire. DeAndre followed closely behind him, his arrogant stride replaced by the weak, shuffling steps of a broken criminal. They were paraded in front of the exact investors they had desperately tried to swindle. The humiliation was absolute and entirely public. I did not feel a single drop of remorse. I did not shed a single tear. I watched them walk through the heavy double doors surrounded by federal windbreakers, and I felt the incredibly heavy burden of my past finally lift from my shoulders. The toxic weight of my family expectations evaporated completely into the crisp night air. Richard remained completely paralyzed on the floor, unable to process the total destruction of his legacy. He stared blankly at the closing doors, refusing to comfort his hysterical wife. The grand dining hall slowly returned to a state of quiet order. The magnificent federal execution was over, leaving nothing but the shattered ruins of their pathetic delusions lying permanently scattered across the cold, pristine marble floor today. 3 days passed since the magnificent federal execution in Greenwich. The dust from the shattered crystal and destroyed egos finally settled, revealing the stark cold reality of the aftermath. Preston and DeAndre remained in federal custody, entirely stripped of their luxury suits and arrogant swagger, waiting for their high-profile arraignment. Clara went completely silent, locking herself inside her mortgaged suburban home while bankruptcy lawyers circled her shrinking assets like hungry vultures. But the absolute loudest noise came directly from my parents. The severe reality of their catastrophic financial ruin finally pierced through their thick layers of absolute denial completely. They realized the massive Greenwich estate was completely lost. They realized their golden son was a federal criminal facing a decade in prison. Most importantly, they finally realized that the daughter they brutally discarded now held the legal deed to the very roof over their heads. The relentless barrage of desperate communication began on Tuesday morning. My secure corporate phone line started ringing relentlessly when I instructed my executive assistant to automatically route their numbers directly to a secure voicemail inbox. The digital notifications flooded my screen in rapid succession. Diane called 27 times in a single frantic afternoon. Richard followed up with 14 lengthy, desperate messages. They utilized every single avenue of communication, attempting to breach the ironclad walls I had erected around my life. I sat at my sleek glass desk overlooking the Manhattan skyline, listening to the pathetic audio recordings with absolute clinical detachment. The sheer audacity of their manipulation tactics was genuinely fascinating to analyze. "Naomi, please pick up the phone." Diane sobbed hysterically in the very first voicemail, her voice cracking with manufactured theatrical agony. "You cannot possibly do this to your own mother and father. We are your family. Blood is thicker than water. Naomi, you have to remember that. We raised you. We put a roof over your head when you were a child. You cannot just throw us out onto the street like common criminals." Preston made a terrible mistake. But we are completely innocent victims in all of this. Please let us keep the house. We have absolutely nowhere else to go. The second voicemail from Richard attempted a different psychological angle, trying to project a flimsy aura of parental authority that he no longer possessed. "Naomi, this has gone far enough," Richard demanded, his voice, attempting to sound firm but trembling with undeniable terror. "You proved your point at the gala. You embarrassed us in front of the entire financial sector. But evicting your parents from their forever home is crossing a line you will deeply regret. We are family. Families fight, but they always forgive each other. We are willing to overlook the harsh things you said if you just transfer the deed back into our names. We can handle the mortgage payments. Just do the right thing and be the bigger person here." I listened to their desperate, pathetic pleas without feeling a single ounce of pity. They did not apologize for facilitating the massive financial fraud. They did not apologize for explicitly excluding me from their fabricated narrative of success. They only cared about maintaining their comfortable lifestyle and preserving their physical address. They weaponized the concept of family only when it directly benefited their survival. When I was struggling, they threw me away. Now that they were drowning, they demanded I act as their personal life raft. I pressed a single button on my keyboard, permanently deleting the entire folder of voicemails. I did not shed a tear. I did not harbor a single second of lingering doubt. I immediately pressed the intercom button connecting me directly to my elite corporate legal team stationed 3 floors below me. I instructed my lead attorney to draft the absolute maximum legal penalty allowed by state housing laws. There would be absolutely no negotiations, no mediation sessions, and 0 direct contact. They wanted to play games with property deeds. So I decided to play strictly by the rigid rule of law. By Thursday afternoon, my legal team finalized the official paperwork. The documents were printed on heavy, watermarked legal paper radiating cold, uncompromising authority. The primary document was a formal 30-day eviction notice legally mandating Diane and Richard to completely vacate the premises or face aggressive physical removal by armed county sheriffs. The legal language was stripped of all emotion, offering no extensions and no possibility of appeal. I reviewed the flawless documents with profound satisfaction, running my fingers over the crisp black ink. But a standard eviction notice felt slightly too impersonal for a betrayal of this magnitude. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out my personal checkbook. I uncapped my fountain pen and filled out the pay section with my mother's legal name. In the amount box, I wrote exactly $500. I signed my name with a smooth, elegant flourish. I stared at the check, remembering a cold, rainy night exactly 15 years ago. I remembered standing on the porch of that exact same house holding a cheap duffel bag. I remembered Diane shoving $500 into my hands and slamming the front door in my face, telling me I was officially a failure and a burden. I reached for a small, square yellow sticky note. I pressed the pen against the paper, writing a short, precise message to accompany the financial instrument. I did not use any emotional language. I did not express anger. I simply wrote, "For your moving truck, the exact amount you threw at me when you kicked me out at 18. I attached the yellow sticky note directly to the center of the $500 check. I placed the check and the note squarely on top of the 30-day eviction notice. I slid the entire stack of documents into a thick, rigid cardboard envelope and sealed it securely. I handed the heavy package to a specialized private courier, dispatching it immediately with strict instructions for swift certified delivery. The courier nodded sharply, turning on his heel and exiting my corporate suite with the precise efficiency I demanded from everyone in my orbit. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind him, permanently sealing the final chapter of my past. I stood completely alone in the center of my vast office. The silence that followed was not empty or hollow. It was rich, heavy, and profoundly beautiful. The pristine white walls were decorated with art pieces highlighting my phenomenal success. A large mahogany bookshelf stood proudly in the corner, displaying the numerous prestigious industry awards I had accumulated entirely on my own merit, without their help, over the long, difficult years of my steady professional growth. I walked slowly across the polished hardwood floor, my heels making a steady rhythmic sound that echoed softly against the walls. I approached the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around my corner office. The spectacular glittering expanse of the Manhattan skyline stretched out endlessly before me. The city was a sprawling, chaotic masterpiece of steel and glass pulsing with relentless kinetic energy. Down below, millions of people were rushing through their daily lives, fighting their own battles, and chasing their own ambitions. Up here on the 40th floor, I was entirely removed from the noise. I placed my hands gently against the cool, thick glass and took a deep, steadying breath. I inhaled the quiet, absolute peace that only comes from aggressively excising a deeply toxic tumor from your life. For 33 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of my family and their crushing expectations. I had allowed Diane and Richard to dictate my worth. I had allowed Preston to use me as a stepping stone for his delusional arrogance. I had let Clara and DeAndre mock my intelligence while they actively engaged in pathetic, fraudulent schemes. They had all operated under the fundamental assumption that I would simply remain in my designated corner, enduring their psychological abuse forever. They genuinely believed that family loyalty meant infinite silent compliance. They were catastrophically wrong, standing here now overlooking the undisputed financial capital of the world. I finally understood the true, undeniable nature of power. True power is never about yelling the loudest in a crowded room. It is never about throwing desperate tantrums or engaging in vicious screaming matches to prove your superiority. True power is the supreme discipline of building yourself up in complete, absolute silence. It is about acquiring knowledge, mastering your specific craft, and constructing an impenetrable fortress of personal and professional independence. You do not need to raise your voice when you hold the undeniable facts in your hands. You simply step aside, drop the evidence on the table, and let the cold, hard truth execute the absolute destruction. The truth is a merciless weapon. and it requires no emotional theatricality to completely obliterate a foundation built entirely on lies. My firm, Aegis Intel, was not just a successful business venture. It was the physical manifestation of my resilience. I had forged this company out of the raw. Broken pieces they handed me when they threw me out into the cold. Every late night, every grueling audit, every strategic acquisition was a brick in the wall of my independence. I had cultivated a reputation for being an unyielding force in the corporate due diligence sector. Investors trusted my judgment because they knew I could not be bought, manipulated, or intimidated. Preston thought he could bypass the rigid rules of reality with a rented tuxedo and some stolen venture capital. He learned the hardest, most devastating lesson possible. The universe eventually balances the scales, and karma always collects its debts with interest. My phone rested silently on my desk. There were no more frantic voicemails. There were no more pathetic attempts at emotional manipulation. The 30-day eviction notice was already speeding toward Greenwich. The federal prosecutors were already assembling the massive wire fraud indictment against my brother and his accomplices. The offshore bank accounts were entirely frozen. The stolen capital would be meticulously recovered and systematically returned to the defrauded investors. The legal machinery was fully in motion, and I did not need to monitor its progress. Clara would inevitably discover that living without stolen funds meant working an actual entry-level job for minimum wage. DeAndre would spend his remaining productive years sitting in a small, cramped, concrete cell, analyzing the severe long-term consequences of his arrogant, overwhelming greed. They were finally experiencing the harsh, painful reality they had so aggressively and deliberately avoided throughout their entirely superficial adult lives. I had played my part flawlessly. I had delivered the evidence, cut the toxic strings, and walked away with my dignity fully intact. I watched the golden afternoon sun slowly begin its descent behind the towering skyscrapers, casting long, beautiful shadows across the bustling city streets. The warm, glowing light washed over my face, filling me with a profound sense of closure. The scared, vulnerable 18-year-old girl who stood on a dark porch holding a cheap duffel bag and a $500 check was officially gone. She had been replaced by a formidable chief executive officer who owned her own narrative and controlled her own magnificent destiny. I turned away from the breathtaking view of the city and walked confidently back to my sleek glass desk. I sat down in my luxurious leather chair, opening my laptop to prepare for my next high-stakes corporate audit. The future was a vast, unwritten canvas, and for the first time in my entire existence, I held the only brush. Sometimes the only way to heal is to let the people who broke you face the absolute consequences of their own actions. Family isn't blood, it's respect. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic relatives? Drop your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of ultimate karma. The story of Naomi's triumph teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of true power. It is forged in silence and executed through undeniable facts rather than emotional outbursts. For years, Naomi's toxic family assigned her the role of the failure, using volume manipulation and cruelty to constantly diminish her worth. In dysfunctional dynamics, the loudest voices often try to dictate reality. However, Naomi did not waste her precious energy screaming back or begging for validation from people fundamentally committed to misunderstanding her. Instead, she channeled her pain into building an impenetrable fortress of competence, financial independence, and unyielding professional integrity. This narrative beautifully illustrates that the ultimate defense against a toxic environment is massive, undeniable success. When confronted with the orchestrated lies of her brother and the vicious gaslighting of her parents, Naomi did not need to raise her voice or match their chaotic energy. The truth, backed by irrefutable evidence and firm boundaries, did all the heavy lifting. She allowed her abusers to build their fragile house of cards and simply let reality knock it down. We learn that we do not have to participate in the dramatic battles our detractors invite us to fight. By stepping back, focusing entirely on our own growth, and mastering our craft, we permanently strip toxic people of their power over our emotional state. Ultimately, this journey reminds us that blood relations do not grant anyone a free pass to exploit our peace or compromise our future. Healing often requires us to stop trying to save people who are actively pushing us underwater, leaving them to face the absolute consequences of their own actions. If you are currently navigating a toxic environment, take a step back today and start building your own silent success.